Hello, I'm Nathan Carlin. This is Life and Work. Life and Work is a series where we talk to scholars and intellectuals about the connections between their public scholarship and their personal lives. Life and Work is supported by the McGovern Center for Humanities and Ethics. Today on Life and Work we have Robert Dykstra. He's the Charlotte Newcomb Professor of Pastoral Theology at Princeton Theological Seminary, where he also serves as chair of the Department of Practical Theology. So today we're with Robert Dykstra. Dr. Dykstra, can you start us off by talking about your educational background?
Sure. I grew up in a small town in southern Minnesota and then traveled across the country after many years in Jackson, Minnesota, to a small college in Spokane, Washington, Whitworth College, and had a wonderful experience there. Majored in psychology and learned from some teachers there about Princeton Seminary. And immediately after graduating from Whitworth, I went to the other coast, out to the East Coast, and started in a Master of Divinity program at Princeton Seminary. After a few years in parish ministry, I returned to Princeton to work on a PhD in my field in pastoral theology. And except for a few years of teaching back in Iowa in the Midwest in this field, I have been in Princeton teaching there ever since.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so you said you majored at Whitworth in psychology. How did you get interested in psychology?
That's a question I'm not sure I have an answer for. I did take one course in high school. It was the only course in psychology offered in my high school. And it was interesting enough, but not overwhelmingly so. But I think part of me was looking for some kind of way to understand myself, I'm sure. And that's probably not unusual for people who start in a field like that. But I thought I would be learning about empathy, about care, about listening skills, counseling, clinical work, and actually when I got into the program at my particular school, it was really nothing like that at all. It was a very sort of empirical program. We trained rats and to run in mazes and put them in Skinner boxes, and hooked ourselves up to all kinds of machines and things like that. So
to measure sort of your heartbeat, or
I mean the whole thing. So I really didn't learn too much about what I thought I was going to be learning, but it was a helpful kind of exposure to the empirical method, and I think it was a pleasant experience. But then when I got to Princeton Seminary, I found for the first time that there was a sort of a field at the theological level too, where that combined my interests in counseling and clinical work and ministry and theology. This field of pastoral theology. So I'd never heard of it before. Arriving at Princeton, and took a couple of courses there and became intrigued about those possibilities.
Did you know that you wanted to go to seminary when you started college, or is that something that sort of emerged over time?
The seed had been planted by a minister who was very influential in my adolescent years, and who became like a second father to me. His name was Henry Fawcett. Interesting man in his own right. He came to work in my little town in Minnesota from Alaska. He was a salmon fisherman in Alaska, Native American. And the only person of color in my entire town, at the community at that time. But he just had a charismatic personality, and he and his wife did not have children of their own, so they were very interested in the children of the community and of the church, and took us under their wing. So, I don't know, maybe when I was 15 or 16, he suggested for the first time that he thought it might be a good idea for me to think of that. And at that time, that was the farthest thing from my mind. I had never once contemplated it before that. I'd long expected to become a dentist or something, and so I rejected that idea initially, I think, fairly strongly. remember thinking, why would I want to bore people for a living, even though this minister was not at all boring in what he said or did.
Yeah.
But somehow I had that image of a minister as someone who bores people to death, or on Sundays or something. I don't know. So by the time I entered college, I think the idea had settled some. I was also thinking of clinical psychology, I think, as a profession, or counseling psychology. And even until the time I graduated from college, I was still debating between psychology programs and a master's in divinity. So,
And what was Henry Fawcett like as a person?
Well, he's still alive now, but so it was and is. But it's hard to describe, I think, because he was such an important figure to me. Just like became a godlike figure in some ways, but very accessible God. I mean, he was just very free. He was funny. He was friendly. He was. I shouldn't be talking in the past tense, but I'm thinking of my adolescence. Mm-hmm. He was very positive, I guess, is what I would say. I mean, he just never seemed to be down. He wasn't fake and like trying to be fake happy or anything like that. But he was just a person who did not seem to experience depression or melancholy. He laughed a lot. He was a solid preacher, a profound preacher, but preached really from experiences of everyday life. He did not go to seminary himself, and yet he was recognized by the Presbyterian Church for his gifts in ministry, and was ordained without a seminary education. One of the few pastors, probably in that denomination that didn't go to seminary. But just natural gifts, friendly, personable, interested, had pastoral sensibilities. Mm-hmm. He seemed to intuitively know how to reach people at the deepest places of their lives, how to counsel people, though he was not trained in counseling. So, again, it was a small town, just a few thousand people, but there were parishioners. By the time he'd been there for a number of years, parishioners from all kinds of churches, dozens of churches in the area were coming to him for counseling.
And I assume you went to him for counseling?
Well, I was in the youth group. I was an adolescent, I think maybe 10 years old when they arrived or something, and all the way through my teen years there with them. So, I guess counseling sort of, but more just for fun or for youth group meetings, or they opened their home to many teenagers in the community, or at least into the church, and so it became their home became sort of a hangout for a group of teens who really cared about each other, and some of my closest friends to this day. And again, I think that was possible because they were interested in kids, and they didn't have children of their own. Mm-hmm. So they made us their, or allowed us to become their family or something.
Yeah. So you have this natural sort of interest in psychology, sort of maybe to sort of get to know yourself better, and you have this kind of special relationship with a minister, and so that takes you to Princeton Seminary, mainly because of Henry Fawcett, it sounds like, and you have this ongoing interest in psychology, and you're at seminary, and you find the kind of psychology that sort of wasn't there at
the kind that matters,
or the kind that matters, the psychology that matters.
I might say.
Yeah. And
the field of pastoral theology really it grew out of more psychoanalytic roots, I think, in the early days. It's a contemporary discipline that emerged in the 1930s and 1940s around a man named Anton Boysen, who was, in some sense, an indirect student of William James, and was profoundly influenced by Freud's works too in his life. But he was also a psychiatric patient. I mean, he was a man who in his early 40s experienced a psychiatric breakdown. His doctors thought it was a severe schizophrenia. And he realized that what he was struggling with was in part a religious struggle, and it had religious roots, but there was no access to religion in the psychiatric hospitals in which he had been admitted, and so he set about on his release from the hospital to find a way to bring ministers into a hospital setting like that, or psychiatric hospital setting, and began a program that came to be known as clinical pastoral education for training ministers and seminarians in the experiences of very troubled, institutionalized persons and patients. But in his own recovery, I think reading Freud was very helpful. Reading William James was very helpful for him, and so and then Boysen's disciples, including one named Stuart Hiltner, became a professor at Princeton Seminary and really started the program in pastoral theology in a formal, sort of structured, disciplinary way at Princeton, and so brought some of Boysen's influences to a discipline, an academic discipline. So there are those roots. I guess.
And you did a unit of CPE, clinical pastoral education, during your own seminary experience. Is that right?
No, but I did several units afterwards.
Afterwards.
Yeah, I'd been a pastor for a couple of years and was sort of assigned. I worked in a very large parish, thousands of members, and one day a week I was assigned as a pastor to go visit our parishioners in the hospital, and invariably on that day of the week I would get a headache because I didn't like to visit the hospital.
Wow.
It was very, for some reason, probably still unconscious, quite threatening to me.
How severe was the headache?
I think just mild.
Just mild, okay, yeah.
I would do the work, but I was stressed by it.
Mm-hmm.
And a pastoral counselor at the time that I was seeing, recommended clinical pastoral education, and I didn't know much about it at the time. But I applied and did a full-year residency in a hospital in downtown Chicago. And
did you give up the church job?
Yeah, it was done.
Yeah,
you done. I finished the church.
And so then you go to Chicago, do a full year of CPE.
Yeah. During that year, I applied for graduate school then in my field. In
Can you tell us what that year was like working as a chaplain? Like what did you do? What did chaplains learn?
It was a wonderful year. I look back on it with great fondness. The program is structured such that we have professional supervisors who are also chaplains, but very immersed in psychotherapeutic technique and guidance and counseling. So that supervisor, in my case, oversaw a group of about 4 chaplains, 4 young resident chaplains, and we were each assigned to various units in this large downtown Chicago hospital. So we would visit patients on those units each day, and then come back also each day to talk about our experiences. We would record conversations or transcribe conversations with patients and critique each other's work in these verbatim
sort of like you could have said this better or said that better or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it was just a beautiful year. I was assigned, I had diverse assignments. One was in an adolescent psychiatric unit of this hospital, so I went there every day. One was in a spinal cord intensive care unit, which was traumatizing for me because many of my patients were young men my age who had just experienced paralysis within the previous 6 weeks from motorcycle accidents or gunshot wounds or something like that. And so we're facing very grim, in the immediate aftermath, in very grim circumstances.
Is there any case that stands out in your memory that was especially moving?
Yes, I mean, well, they're all moving in
They're- yeah.
in the sense of,
Yeah.
I think more the sense of threat. I mean, these young people were so, I mean, they were experiencing such trauma with this severe injury that there wasn't sort of a lot of conversation. I remember sometimes I would just sit on at their sides or even on the floor looking up when sometimes they were facing down in their special beds. I would sit sometimes on the floor underneath them looking up at them and trying to talk or comfort them. But I do remember a number of the instances of being brought into relationship with, I don't know, one young man who was probably 20 years old from the south side of Chicago and had been shot in a gang-related fight and was paralyzed from the bullet. And that was it was a nice connection for me to talk with someone who had come from a very different walk of life, but to be in that very intimate and delicate space and just share those days together. So there, and then I also worked on, just a general medical floor too, where patients might be sort of less severe or less specialized than these sort of adolescent or spinal cord.
Case of the flu
Yeah.
or general surgery or something like that.
Cancer treatment.
Cancer treatment.
Things like
Yeah, and what do you remember what it was like to interact with the hospital staff? Did you have much interaction with them?
that. Sure. Yes. And that was a growing experience too. I think because I'd been probably as a seminarian and as a minister a little bit intimidated by the vastness or the scope of the medical system. I felt impressed by, kind of intimidated by the fact that others in that setting, the medical staff seemed to know what they were doing, or they seemed to be able to manipulate medicines or IVs or do surgeries or do things that were very powerful in terms of the healing process. And I was a little bit unsure of what my role was in that place, or at least trying to learn my way into that place, into a different kind of understanding of healing. The healing that comes from talking or listening or waiting or silence in the midst of these threats. So I think one of the learnings for me was just to learn that over time that the medical staff too is human, and that they too struggled, and that they valued my presence. That often surprised me, but that they valued having someone from time to time to turn to when medicine was had less to offer than they had hoped. So it just it became kind of I think I just developed a growing confidence that that I could approach these people and have conversations, and also just begin to attend to their needs too. I mean, to treat them as people who I was interested in learning about. And
So as a chaplain, you were caring for not just the patients, but
right.
the house staff
I think
as well.
that's right.
Yeah.
And vice versa. They were caring for me. So
Yeah.
it was really nice.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my memories of that year were really quite positive. And so I work with students a lot now, encourage them to think about this kind of ministry too. Or this kind of experience. Huge advocate
of CPE.
For clinical pastoral.
Yeah,
Exactly.
And so you had to recap the initial interest in psychology, your mentor, Henry Fawcett, then you're working as a pastor, and then the church suggests, or during your own pastoral counseling, the counselor suggests, well, why not do CPE? You do CPE. So I assume that your sort of interest in psychology would sort of be sort of deepening or
Yeah, it all fit into
it all
this these interests that were long-standing, I think, and so it seemed. I mean, in one sense, I applied for a doctoral program. I think out of peer pressure, one of my seminary classmates was applying, and I thought, well, if he can apply, then I should apply. There was.
And what field?
He was applying in systematic theology.
And you were applying in.
Well, eventually pastoral theology.
Pastoral theology.
Yeah, and pastoral theology is this field that combines psychology, or psychology and the broader social sciences with theological interests or biblical studies and other fields of interest to me. So it seemed somewhat like a natural fit. At that point, I thought I would just learn how to be a better counselor so I could go back into parish ministry.
More about technique.
Yeah. Or about human life, or how to navigate these big questions of life and death and trauma and tragedy and or ordinary problems of marital problems or trouble with teenagers or. I just felt constantly overwhelmed, I think, in both parish settings and in the hospital.
And in the hospital.
With these big issues big and little issues that.
So you pursued a PhD in pastoral theology to become a better pastor.
That was the original plan.
Yeah.
Yes.
And what happened? Like what shifted?
What went wrong?
Yeah. Did you fell in love with academics or?
No, it was just a gradual shift over several years. That it was a 5-year program, and during those years, I was also working actually as a part-time hospital chaplain in the local Princeton hospital, which was a wonderful immersion and experience too over those graduate school years. But I think just over time, I began to entertain the possibility of teaching if I could. If I would be allowed to or given a job in this. I don't remember it being any great revelation or aha moment or anything like that.
It just a slow shift.
A slow entertaining of the possibility.
Yeah. And then at Princeton anyway, you mentioned Seward Hiltner. Was sort of the kind of the founding kind of figure and kind of pastoral theology. Then the second generation would be Donald Capps, and then you would be the third generation. Is that a fair way of saying it? Like
yes and yes. At one level, it certainly is. And the teacher, though, interestingly, that brought me back to Princeton for doctoral work was Sandra Brown, who was a student of Seward Hiltner. Mm-hmm. So and Donald Capps had just arrived at Princeton Seminary as I was leaving as a Master of Divinity student, and I didn't know him at that point, but I'd had a couple of classes with Dr. Brown. She was a charismatic teacher, funny and passionate and interested in students, and she drew me back. But over those graduate school years, it was really my relationship with Don Capps that began to grow and develop. And he was not a student of Hiltner, but he did sort of take Hiltner's position at the time that Hiltner retired. And so in that sense, kind of carried on, or brought his own tradition, I guess, or brought his own perspective to Princeton Seminary. And became a deeply, again, over time, over those years of my program there, became a very important influence and mentor in my own life.
Like Henry Fawcett.
Well,
yeah.
I guess so, yeah.
Yeah.
He became like another one of those father figures who have been so influential in my life.
And what would, I assume, that everybody puts their own touch on the field, that Seward Hiltner would have a view, Donald Capps and Sandra Brown would have their view, and then you would have your own view of pastoral theology, and what would that be?
Yeah, what is pastoral theology? It's a difficult deal to define, I think, and partly because it involves, as I've said or hinted already, it involves a kind of entering into human suffering at the margins of existence and then trying to make some sort of sense out of that. I mean, it's an academic discipline, and so we're thinking and writing and reading about this kind of entree into human suffering and trying to make some kind of meaning of it in terms of the Christian tradition, the biblical witness, the doctrines of our faith, but trying to do that through lenses of that remain very close and grounded in human experience. So I like to think of pastoral theology as kind of an aesthetic discipline or imagination, a form of imagination, a form of looking at things, a way of looking at things, or even making beautiful the simple or somehow seemingly uneventful moments of people's lives, and trying to talk about those in light of our Christian witness, but by zeroing in on the individual case or the lives of individuals, the specific contexts, the specific dilemmas, the uniquenesses of individual lives, family life, community life, church life, congregational life, to try and help people ultimately formulate meaning and hope at these sort of liminal places, at the edges of the boundaries of human experience, the boundaries of human existence, really. So it's kind of an imaginative entering into the limit situations in order to generate hope via these, very pragmatic discourses.
These disciplines close to human experience, and that would again take us sort of back to psychology.
Of course, yeah.
And are there schools of psychological thought that are important to you, or that you feel like you're drawn to? It sounds like you're not drawn to the empirical, the rat studies and the surveys and so forth.
Well, actually, I am. I'm still sort of grateful for that empirical immersion. I think it's really important whenever we can ground our theories in scientific experimentation, or
we should.
Well, why not? I mean, it's a wonderful gift, but many of the kinds of healing we're trying to do don't lend themselves easily to just sort of a step-by-step technique, or
as a minister,
as a counselor, as a therapist, we could do scientific methods of dealing with cardiac arrest or something like that, but that's different than healing a broken heart. I mean, there are different ways of entering into these. So empiricism is great. We'll take what we can get whenever we can ground our theories in, methods and realities like that. But I think the more honest or accurate influences have been probably threefold in my life there, and these have come to me in my own through these teachers and mentors that I've had, and I think they're sort of historically present in Princeton Seminary's program of pastoral theology too, and they are sort of Freudian or post-Freudian psychoanalysis. The work of Carl Rogers in the Freud, of course, at the beginning of the 20th century especially. Carl Rogers in the middle of the 20th century was a hugely influential psychotherapist and interestingly a great empiricist himself. He did many experiments in terms of the counseling world and counseling relationship to test them out in scientific ways. And then I guess more recently, at the end of the 20th century, I was the work of Steve DeShazer and Insoo Kim Berg in solution-focused brief therapy. So all three of these are really distinctive schools of thought of psychotherapy. They don't easily fit together philosophically or theoretically, but they've all just kind of captured my imagination at one point or another, and they keep returning in my syllabi, in my courses, in my the work that I do with others, and in the way that I practice counseling, I think, with mostly with students now in my care.
So you're drawn to these three, both because they're sort of interesting, and then also because they work.
Yeah, I try to help. I mean, much of my teaching is trying to help students learn how to attend to others in their suffering, learn how to counsel and think of themselves as healers. But each of these approaches seems to have its place, and maybe its time would be a better way to say it, in terms of the kind of emphasis or healing that it might offer. So Freud was very interested in the unconscious experience, in things that we didn't know that we knew, things that we have forgotten in our lives, and was very much interested, therefore, in the childhood past of his clients. And I don't do Freudian psychoanalysis with anyone in my care, but I do help them attend to maybe forgotten or shameful memories from childhood, moments from childhood that they might otherwise easily overlook. So that's kind of the psychoanalytic exposure, I think, takes students to the realm of their past, their childhood past, and trying to see how those lingering moments may be influencing their lives in the present. Carl Rogers, however, was very interested in present experience. He really wanted to be present with the clients in the one-on-one of the counseling relationship, the intimacy of the moment of sitting with someone and listening deeply to their feelings. And so it was very much a reflection in his work of what was happening within him and what he was hearing was happening within the life of the client at that very moment that they were talking together. And that's important to me too. So to hear the students that I counsel or the people that I care for, to hear what's happening to them right then and there, to hear their feelings, to reflect on their feelings and their thoughts, and to let them know that they're being attended to is really important to me, and I think helpful for students learning how to do ministry. And then, as I said, later in my career, I became exposed to solution-focused therapy, introduced to it again by Don Capps. And the work of solution focus is very much not interested in the past, not even so much interested in the present, but more focuses with clients on the imagined future that they will have when the problem that brings them into the counselor's office disappears. So it's a really unique way of approaching a problem. The therapists in this approach don't really care about the problem. They want to know what's going to happen when the problem is gone. How will you know that the problem is gone? What will be different in your relationships or in how you live day to day in 3 months from now or 6 months from now when this problem has disappeared? And that's a very difficult way to think. It's an imaginative projection into the future. But it reminded me, too, that we are shaped by these future visions and dreams as much as we are shaped by our childhood past, I think.
That's really interesting. And I like the typology of it, past, present, and future.
Yeah.
So psychoanalysis in the past, sort of Carl Rogers in the present, and then solution-focused in the future.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And, hearing you talk about these schools of psychology, it occurs to me that there is something similar, although probably not as kind of systematic, just in what I observe in kind of medical education around here.
Mm-hmm.
With psychoanalysis, I would say whenever psychoanalysis is brought up or Freud's name is brought up, it's usually sort of laughed at and dismissed.
Yes.
On the one hand. On the other hand, there's all kinds of terms and ideas that they're taught, and the medical students all believe that are true. Like, I'll give you an example, like projection, transference, countertransference, displacement. unconscious. Like all of these terms, they'll all say it is, it's completely true. But whenever they're taught about these terms, Freud is never credited. And I think that's kind of intentional to sort
Sure.
of, and so that's where I see sort of psychoanalysis with Carl Rogers and a kind of Rogerian way of thinking. I know that as sort of bioethics, medical humanities was sort of getting started, those folks up at the University of Rochester Medical School, they were all reading Carl Rogers and they loved him. And they even, the big catchphrase was sort of patient-centered therapy, taken directly from Rogers, person-centered therapy. And I think that was just so hugely kind of influential with us to this day. And then with solution focused, I don't know if they use that term or not, but I think they do in various, not just in psychiatry, but in sort of clinical internal medicine or outpatient encounters. They'll have techniques that the medical students and residents are taught, like if you're 7 now, what would it take you to get to an 8 or a 9 and so forth. So it's really interesting that all
Yes.
of these sort of schools of theology are floating around in medicine, but not, in my point of view, not in any systematic or coherent kind of way. And what you're doing in theological education, it's much more structured and kind of thought out. And here it seems to be a little more haphazard. And I think we can sometimes in medical education, I think we can sometimes jump onto a slogan and things get pushed along. And anyway, it just seems kind of interesting that there's
this kind of overlap or kind of lingering of these themes or ideas or something, or the residue of these important ideas are still around, but not necessarily attributed to their sources.
And at the end of the day, I think it's, well, why is that? And I think we're ministers and doctors or other health professionals. We are trying to help people, and it's like, I like what you said, that it's not all, you can have heart problems, but then what do you do for a broken heart? And I think that to a lesser extent, I think we try to do that and attend to broken hearts as well, or sort of defeated spirits or something.
I hope so. I mean, I hope that's certainly what you're trying to do, I think, in medical humanities, and to both help doctors see that they are human and they have had childhoods and experiences of trauma and joy in their past, but also that they are attending to real people who are far more complex than a medical condition might, or a diagnosis. I mean, they're just richly. By the way, Freud is equally held in suspicion in my school too, and among my students. I mean, the instant reaction is always negative. I mean, it's almost exclusively negative among my students, and they don't read Freud generally. I mean, in most cases, they're not really reading these texts. Although I think if they would, they'd see that. Freud made mistakes and he got off the beaten path sometimes with speculative thought that was not in any way based on his case studies, but more often that he argued with himself, he changed his mind, he doubted his conclusions. So not only did he write beautifully, I mean, he just writes beautifully, even in the English translations, it's beautiful literary work, but he's wrestling with very difficult human problems and trying to figure out what has caused them and what might work to help people who are suffering from them. And so he gets it wrong sometimes, but he gets a lot right. And as you said, his influence is just it's everywhere in the culture, even if we're not acknowledging it. So it's hard to avoid it. I mean, it's hard to avoid his influence.
You mentioned a little bit earlier in our conversation. You said childhood shame has been a big topic for you, and I think I heard you in one of your sermons say one time that if you had to narrow your work down to sort of one theme, what is it that you do with seminary students?
Yeah.
You said something like, I want them to come to terms with their childhood shame, or what is that? What do you, or, you know, yeah.
It's probably me trying to come to terms with my childhood shame. I think of course at some level, but that's true that if there's a theme that runs through many diverse courses that I teach, it might be just helping students stop and reclaim parts of themselves that have been split off because they're too difficult to remember or deal with, or they've just simply been forgotten or repressed, to use the Freudian term that seems to make a lot of sense to me. And that's because I mean, partly I do it for the sake of the students themselves, for their own well-being. I think that the more complex we allow ourselves to be, the more of our own experiences we can allow back into our experience, or can begin to name verbally, or to another person, or in writing, even to ourselves sometimes, the more wholesome and healthy we feel. But I think also I do it because I believe that those are the things that get in the way of our listening carefully to other people. So if I want to help my students become better helpers or healers of others' hearts or souls or minds, then I think they need to be willing to sort of face their own anxieties and fears and suffering and sorrow.
That's interesting. You have to be able to listen to yourself before you can listen to others.
I think so. And, I might just see a student for 12 days of one semester before, sending them out into these very challenging situations of ministry that we all face. And so it's hard to know what in that limited amount of time I have with them might be the most helpful path to their becoming better able to care for others. And this is one way that it seems to me, by helping them sort of revisit their past, giving them permission to remember, giving them permission to write about their own struggles, is one of those important paths to me.
That's the beauty and clarity of that is really striking to me, and again I see this connection to medical education, where we're constantly trying to say, well, how is it that we can make medical students more empathetic, and basically what that means is, like, how do we make them better listeners, and
yes.
so there's this whole tradition of pastoral theology, pastoral care, that you're training generation after generation of students, and that I think is deeply relevant to medical education, and that analogy could be the same, that medical students need to be able to listen to themselves before they can listen to others, and the time is maybe even more limited, both within medical school and then also in their time with patients, unless they're
under such pressure to perform, or to I don't know, to move on to the next case or something. But I do think that if there could be a place, and maybe it is true in your classroom in medical humanities, but if there could be a place to carve out for them a chance to talk about their wounds, there's also a chance that those wounds might be exposed to the light of day and begin to heal in a new way, those emotional wounds, those psychological or spiritual wounds. And I think, you mentioned shame, but the nature of shame is such that it's very sticky. It sticks to our own lives. We can't get rid of it. You can remember an incident in first grade in which you experienced shame from your teacher or a classmate or something, and when you talk about it, it comes right back. I mean, you feel almost the same heated emotion that you felt as a 6-year-old or something, and so it's sticky that way. But it's also contagious in that we're kind of afraid of other people's shame. We feel ourselves being ashamed of others' shame, And that's part of this back and forth, that if we can't deal with our own, it's going to be hard for us to sort of encounter the other's shame with any kind of openness or integrity.
Sticky and contagious, yeah.
Yeah. I remember, but in terms of this listening thing, I thought of a story. One of my friends was a minister doing clinical pastoral education at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, the famous hospital. This was he was talking to a psychiatric resident. My friend was holding a verbatim document, a written transcript of a conversation that he'd had with a patient that he was going to present to his CPE group. And the psychiatric resident said, "What's that?" And my friend explained what a verbatim was and how it worked and how they talked about it and tried to help each other listen in more attentive ways to the patients. And the psychiatric resident said, "Oh, I wish we could learn how to do that. We don't get any time here learning how to listen to a patient. We just learn how to prescribe medication and give electroconvulsive shock treatments or therapies or something." And that was stunning, at one of the premier hospitals in the world, to hear a psychiatric resident say, "We don't learn how to talk to people."
Yeah, if you can't talk to a psychiatrist, who can you talk
exactly.
to?
And that, it's... but he wanted to learn. I mean, he also wanted to learn, but it wasn't a part of his program or his training. So, anyway, that's interesting.
That is very interesting. And you have a new book out, Finding Ourselves Lost, and childhood shame is a big theme there. Can you tell us about the book?
Sure. The title is Finding Ourselves Lost, Ministry in the Age of Overwhelm. And it's really a collection of essays I've written over the last 10 years or so that in which I've been trying to sort of define what my discipline is, I guess, in a way that might be helpful for students. But it's not easy to do, and so I've been working on it for many years and in very many different sort of manifestations in these chapters. Because I work in a Christian seminary, there is a thread that follows throughout many or most of the articles in terms of looking at the life of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke and trying to see how he became known as a healer. And really, I think I've come to conclude mostly as a kind of a psychiatric healer. I think he was healing people who had, physiological symptoms of emotional disorders or social marginalization or shame that existed in the culture of the day. And Jesus knew how to sort of separate that out and speak to it in a way that brought healing in ways that other physicians of his day could not. So that thread runs through a lot of the chapters. But
so it a psychosomatic disorder where somebody's blind or paralyzed or something like that.
Most all the symptoms that he healed could easily be sort of seen as psychosomatic, really, as somatoform disorders.
And these stories were remembered because Jesus was a sort of a remarkable healer and.
Exactly, yeah. And what became interesting to me as I studied his healing was that he instructed. It wasn't just sort of. I mean, it is miraculous whenever any kind of psychiatric healing takes place because these conditions are so entrenched and difficult. If you've ever tried to convince an anorexic girl to give up the eating disorder, how difficult it is. It's just entrenched and painful and sometimes deadly. But he also, but it wasn't. So it is miraculous in that sense. But he also told his followers that they should become healers. I mean, he instructed them to do it too. So it wasn't like you have to be Jesus to do it. He assumed that he could teach these sort of approaches or this way of being in the world to those who were following him. And that's interesting to me because ministers in particular often feel very nervous about thinking of themselves as healers or as if they're responsible for being good counselors or listeners or healers in that sense. I don't know, maybe there's a trajectory in medical education too, where doctors have to come into this identity of thinking of themselves as a healer, as an agent of healing. I don't know, but ministers are quite reluctant to do that. They think, only God does this, or Jesus must do this, but I can't. But Jesus instructs people to do it. And so, again, this theme of shame and childhood experience comes to the fore in many of these chapters, in many of these different lectures that I've given over the years. In the sense that I think most of the conditions he healed were wounds, psychological wounds that emerged from social marginalization, and that's true of many of the wounds that we carry, I think, from childhood, from our own differences, from our own humiliation, from our own sense of otherness, and that's true for many people in far more severe ways than it might be for you and me. But for most of us, those experiences are still nevertheless quite powerful and real. So that's one of the themes, as I just invite the ministers and seminary students I'm really writing this for to think back in the way we've already talked about to their childhood. Try and revisit those things that they couldn't talk about in their families, that were not allowed to be discussed. To learn to share that with another person, another human being, a trusted counselor, or someone who will not abuse that confidence. And really talking with another person about these things might be the very same thing as revisiting one's shame, or maybe you have to talk to someone before you can have the courage or confidence to revisit one's shame. But I just think the idea is to help people feel less lonely by being heard, and to share these stories with one another as best we can, or when we're able to do so, when we feel that we're ready to do so. And then a third theme that seems to come out in a number of these essays too is that of really, I don't know how I would say it. I guess to pay attention to use these stories in ways to pay attention to others in the way that they're different, to attend to the unique differences of the people in our care. So there's a lot that we share in common. The geneticists tell us that, just to get over to the threshold of being human, we share something like 99.8% of the chromosomal base pairs that make up our DNA. That's what makes us human. A 0.2% difference is the only difference between you and me, or me and Jesus, or me and Hitler. It's a very small difference, but those differences really matter. They make huge, they make for wars, they make for peace, they make for everything that makes the headlines day by day. And so to look at those tiny differences between people, and to see how those differences may have caused pain in their lives, or caused them to suffer, or maybe to triumph as well, but to learn how to pay attention to their differences. And finally, there's a theme that I hold out in here, that we should pay attention to those people who have faith in us, and that really faith becomes not my trying to believe in someone else, it's my trying to believe in someone else's belief in me. It's a bit of a reversal, but and that brings me back to these important mentors in my life that we started this conversation with. Henry Fawcett believed in me as a boy. He saw something in me that I didn't see in myself, or couldn't believe in myself, certainly. And so at times when I doubt myself, or doubt my ability, or doubt my faithfulness, or my ministry, then I have to believe in his belief in me, his faith in me. And I still do. And I still need that from time to time. And he still reassures me that he still believes in me. And that's a line this is a theme that I developed from it's actually Donald Caps's understanding of healing as well. And so that's one that I've simply borrowed directly from him. And
believing in those who believe in us.
Yeah, exactly. And certainly he was one of those who believed in me and believed in you. We share a mentor in common who believed in us at those times when it might be difficult to believe in ourselves.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
That's a theme too that keeps popping up in some of these works.
Yeah, and I can see that being really important for all of us. I can see it being really important to medical students. It's so many points along the way students find themselves doubting themselves. The pressure is so.
Of course, it's so intense, and there's got to be so many ways to feel a failure. Mm-hmm. Guess, or to feel that I don't have enough in me to do all that's expected of me.
Yeah, and the stakes just seem so high, and
yes,
and it just the pressure seems so relentless, and so that I do really, it's a beautiful image, and
it's less punishing, I think, than sometimes when you think you're supposed to will yourself into having faith in God or what in a program or in a vocation or something. It's hard to will one. I think it's hard to do that.
Yeah. But believing in somebody else's belief in us.
Yeah, that's a little easier.
They did the work.
Yeah, exactly. They did it for us.
Yeah.
And, they're probably wrong, but they nevertheless are sincere.
Yeah.
And maybe it's enough to keep us going for another day.
Yeah.
To keep us going on.
Yeah. And I think it's a beautiful message. I'm glad it's so prominent in your book. We're almost out of time. I would be really curious about what you think about the future of pastoral theology. Where would you like to see it go, or are there dangers, or are there opportunities?
I think I probably have not entirely faithfully represented the whole trajectory of the discipline among my peers, in that I do tend to focus more on the power of attention to the individual and the context in which that individual lives and works and moves and struggles, than the discipline as a whole. Which is focusing more now on sociopolitical contexts and economics, even broad social issues and cultural issues. Those are really important to me too. Obviously, we're caught up in a time where the nation is confused, the world is feeling threatening. We're living in this, as my book's subtitle says, in this age of overwhelm. And so these are broad social forces that catch all of us up in their power. But somehow I want to try and retain this historic emphasis in pastoral theology on attention to the individual. And I am sometimes feeling like a voice crying in the wilderness. That might be too extreme to say, because many of my colleagues are so good at this too. They're just good at listening to people who are struggling, who are suffering, and trying to think in these broadly contextual ways. These look at the social forces that create oppression, that create this suffering, and so. But I guess there's just a slight shift in emphasis, or at least what I am hoping in this book is to retain something of this emphasis on the inner psychological world of individuals, as the discipline as a whole rightly and justly focuses on these broad cultural forces that create suffering within individuals. So I don't want to lose that more recent emphasis over the last several decades in the field, but I want to retain something of the power of looking at an individual within. So that's kind of my own trajectory. Whether or not it will be received or heard or retained in the field is another question. But I just it's a beautiful discipline. It's a beautiful field of study. It's eclectic. It's rich. It's personal. It's autobiographical, and it gets to the nitty-gritty of people's lives. It meets people where they are, in the middle of the marketplace, in the middle of the hospital, in the middle of the prison, and tries to struggle with them about the hard questions of life and death in those circumstances. So it's always exciting, and it's wide open in terms of the materials we can read and study and examine and put to good use in this purpose of helping people feel less lonely in the world.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Thank you, Professor Dykstra. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks so much.